Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting series from IT Pro TV. My name is Vaughn Smith, and I'm your host for this show, which is the Cisco Cloud Fundamentals for exam number 210-451. And in this episode, we're going to take an introductory look at some cloud characteristics. And here to help us is the one and only Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you?
I am doing well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining me as we actually begin our Cloud Fundamentals series here. It's actually for us, when we start talking about the CCNA Cloud Fundamentals, it's one of two exams that we're going to be diving into so that you can earn your CCNA in the idea, of course, of the cloud technologies sponsored by Cisco or from Cisco itself. But before we get started, we want to make sure that we understand at least the very basics as we get started, because some of us, we may have been working in the infrastructure for a while, and now your company is saying, hey, we want to actually move to the cloud and want to take a look at this idea of the Cisco solution and understand it from that standpoint. And that's what we want to make sure that we're actually doing here, is that we get a good foundation to do so.
Yeah, because it's all the buzz nowadays, right? Everything's moving to the cloud, and I know there's there's kind of different flavors of the cloud from at least my standpoint of knowing there's like Azure and there's AWS, and so how does Cisco and the CCNA for this particular exam kind of work within what is the cloud? Right.
So when it begins, right, when we start taking a look, Cisco itself, in terms of the cloud technologies, it's another competitor to some of the things that Vaughn has just mentioned here. And the reason why we actually have to understand that is because the two major players in this market right now is pretty much the ones that Vaughn mentioned. The idea of Microsoft Azure, okay, and of course the idea of AWS, the Amazon Web Services, right? So those are probably the two big gorillas in the entire arena right now. And there are many other smaller vendors out there that also have cloud technologies that you can jump into, and Cisco is one of those as well. Now, when we start to take a look, though, what we want to do is actually kind of go, all right, let's not just go, all right, yeah, we're putting everything into a cloud and just start out that way, okay? We want to at least have an understanding of what we mean by the idea of cloud here so that we can actually get started from that very fundamental aspect that you may not have actually taken a look at it before, and then we'll bring you up to speed when we start talking about some of the different technology that Cisco wants you to be familiar with. And of course, it's not just all the vendor ones that are out there, but it actually does have more to do, of course, with the Cisco offering in terms of the cloud. So Vaughn, that is where we are going to get started when we start taking a look, which is the idea of the definition is where we want to go, okay? So when it comes down to this idea of the definition, we want to talk about the idea here of what it actually is, okay, and why we also need it, okay? And the reason why we want to actually make sure that we understand what is going on is because there's been, at least in terms of the IT world, some challenges that we faced in terms of the traditional IT environment. When we start talking about that idea of the traditional IT environment, that's usually the place where you end up working. Whether you're in a small business environment or whether you're actually in a medium or even large corporation, a lot of times we have a lot of infrastructure that's stored right where we are, okay? And that means that we have to actually be able to take care of the equipment. We also have to take care of the end user's needs that are out there. And sometimes we have to actually realize that we don't have enough of that. And so now we're faced with some challenges here in terms of the traditional infrastructure. So when we start to talk about the idea of some of those challenges, let's take a look at my screen. I went ahead and typed out 3 of those challenges that we want to at least take a look at before we move on here, because it essentially, Vaughn, the idea of the cloud is kind of a response to this idea of these challenges here, saying, hey, we need to be able to do better. We need to be able to fix what's actually going to happen if we don't. And the reason why is that the expansion of technology has actually made sure at some particular point here, right, that we just don't have enough money to take care of the things we do. We don't have enough resources, whatever it might be. We need to understand these particular technologies, and then we'll talk about why the cloud is actually good for us. So the first one, Vaughn, that I want to talk about here is the idea of resource utilization. Now, Vaughn, traditionally, you and I have actually kind of been working for the same company for quite a while at times in our past, and now we're working for the another company again, but in the same aspect. Well, there used to be a point when we would actually build up the infrastructure and at the center that we were actually working at, and when we did so, we kind of, bought servers and we put them in, And then we would actually run things like the Active Directory domain controller, okay? But that would be all that we would run on that machine. And regardless of how beefy or how high performing that server was, Vaughn, a lot of times that was the only thing we did with it. So what we would actually be able to do if we were running something like Windows Server 2012 or 2016, we could right click on the taskbar, go into the task manager, and we look at the CPU utilization. And Vaughn, it might register maybe 3%, okay, at times. Now, during people logging on, it would kind of jump up to, maybe to 10, 15, 20% though. But what we're talking about there is resource utilization, and that was relatively low because then you started separating out other servers into their own environment. And when you started doing that, it started costing a lot of money to be able to separate out those roles. So then you started combining them, saying, we don't need that much. We can actually put all of it on one server. But when we did that as well, Vaughn, the resource utilization then turned into another handicap, which is what if that physical server failed? Well, now, with that physical server failed, I not only brought down a single server, but I brought down the roles that I needed to make sure that the infrastructure would run, okay? So that resource utilization itself is something that we go, whoa, yeah, right. That's actually a kind of a hindrance or a challenge to what we're actually taking a look at. So in that sense, that's what can happen. Okay?
And we were in a fairly small company. I mean, you take that on a much larger scale, you might not have enough resources to be able to power everything, and everything's clocking at like 100%,
Right.
and you need more. But I think that kind of ties into the next point is the cost. Right.
And if you think about it, that's exactly where we're going. Okay. So for a small company, it did cost us some because we were on a fairly limited budget as well. But for a big company, it's easy, Vaughn. So all the things that I said, once you start hitting those resources, that utilization, like what you're talking about, 80, 90%, oh, simple. We'll just bring up another server and, that will be it. Well, then you pay a bunch of money for a server. You get it installed. You get the operating system put on it. You get all this stuff, and you put it on there, and then you have to install that role and make sure that it works and does everything else too. Well, when you keep adding additional servers into your network, you add to the complexity of your network first. But overall, though, what we call the idea of CapEx here, which is capital expenditure, Vaughn, okay? So there's two operational costs that we tend to think about. CapEx is capital expenditure. That's stuff you pay for up front, okay? And you go, all right, I've paid for it. Now I get my chance to be able to use it. And then there's operational expenditures, and that is saying, hey, I'm paying for the cost of just operating this instead. Well, the whole goal of just about every IT department is not to spend a ton of money here, okay, which is just buying the hardware. And Vaughn, at this point, it's not even configured to use, okay? So Vaughn, we buy, let's say 2 or 3 brand new servers. That's what we did in the last center. We bought 3 brand new servers at the same time. It ended up costing us quite a bit of money, okay? But then it still took us, let's say, 2 or 3 days to configure it the way that we needed to. And if you think about that, that's added time, and that means higher capital expenditures before we even got any real use out of it. So that is a limitation in terms of traditional IT.
Yeah, I remember you guys would always be in the server closet. I remember when I first got there, like, oh yeah, go in the closet, and I'm like, you mean to hang coats? I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, you mean where all the computers live? Okay,
Right.
That was a long time ago. But I realized, but you guys were in there a lot, always fixing stuff and patching down cables and doing all sorts of stuff, and it was a lot of time.
And that is where we start moving towards the operational side of things, right? So we're paying for upkeep, we're making sure that things are going right. But if a server now has a hardware failure in terms of like a hard drive, we had to get in there and replace those things. We had to make sure that everything was running. That's where operational expenses come in too.
And it was kind of a nice thing for the business because you're not only teaching the technology, you're working on it. But if you are in an organization that doesn't have built-in IT support, then you're going to need to contract that out or have specialists come in to set everything up. And that's going to be a lot of money for people with those particular skills coming in to do that for your business.
Yeah, and there's no doubt. And that's where that CapEx is usually the one that most people start to groan about when you start talking about buying new servers. It's not the very fact that they can't be configured. You can always do that. But when you start having to hire it out or even get other people to configure it because now they have to take time out of their day when they could be doing something else, it starts to add up in its cost before you can even use it. And that's something that we have to think about when we start doing it. So another traditional challenge for us is what we're talking about there, okay? And the other one that I want to mention, there's a lot more, but the final one here that I have at least on my list is the idea of inflexibility. Now, what I mean by this is that if you actually take a look at the idea of network design, is that you normally take a look at your network and go, here's what I need, okay? And so once you actually figure and discover the purpose of your network, that's what you build towards, right? You always build the idea of a purpose-centered type of network, purpose-driven network, in that sense. And you design your network that way to grow in those fashions, okay? Now, when you do that, you're essentially binding yourself in terms of that to that hardware design. Now, Vaughn, this doesn't actually mean a lot to most of us, okay? But Cisco in last decade, or I'm going to say 20 years now, okay? They've actually said, look, we need to be able to standardize some of network design here. And that's the reason why is that when we tend to build networks, Vaughn, we tend to build it off of whoever's building network, and they actually build it the way that they want to, okay? Well, when that happens, that means, Vaughn, if I now end up leaving the company, now I turn over that network to Vaughn, and Vaughn goes, I don't have a clue what Ronnie put in there, okay? Well, that might mean that that particular design is relatively inflexible. Now her boss comes and says, hey, we need to add in these services, and Vaughn's like, I don't know what that's going to do if I add that in. Is it going to break the network? Is it going to actually work the way that it needs to? We don't know because we are bound to that original design. So it's relatively inflexible in that way. And the purpose has to be that. Now, what can happen if you add in a server or you add in additional infrastructure and it's not actually part of the original design? If you talk about the idea of routing and switching, Vaughn, what it can actually do is reflow the way that traffic works, okay? And when you go, no, everything was working fine in this way, but now that I've added in the switch, all the traffic's going over here, and I don't need it to go there. That's an extra hop that I don't need, or an extra device I don't really need it to go through. Well, now what do? Do you take it out, or do you actually try and figure out how you reconfigure the network to make it work? So now it's another challenge that you have to think about. And so, Vaughn, in all of this, in terms of the traditional aspects that we're talking here and these challenges, all of that essentially are limitations of what we can do, right? So we're limited by our environment. We're limited by the very fact that when we actually start doing the utilization here, the money that we have to expend out, the inflexibility of all this stuff that we have tells us that there has to be a better way and a better function to do so. And the reason why we also have to do this is because, well, data itself continues to grow, continues to challenge our traditional ideas of design here. And that is when we start moving towards the idea of cloud computing is what we start moving towards here. So Vaughn, you've probably heard everybody talk about this at some point in time when it's been mentioned somewhere. You might have overheard somebody like, oh yeah, we're going to move to the cloud. And then you kind of start asking yourself, well, what the heck does that mean when we talk about moving infrastructure to the cloud? Sounds fancy. It's the buzzword that you hear every day now. But overall, though, when somebody actually talks about that, okay, we have to actually ask, what does that really mean? And the weirdest thing about this, Vaughn, is that if you ask 5 or 6 people, they'll tell you 5 or 6 different answers. And that itself is a challenge. And so one of the things that I wanted to show is actually that very thing. So let me show you what I'm actually doing, okay? I went ahead and just did a cloud search about, what is cloud computing? I know you can hardly see that here, okay? What is cloud computing? And once I started doing that, as I scroll down here, we're not going to actually take a look at every single one of these, but I wanted to just show you a few of them, okay? So simply put, cloud computing is a delivery of computer services. Services, storage, databases, networking, service intelligence, and more, okay? Wow, that sounds awesome. All right, what does AWS say? Explore the benefits of cloud computing with Amazon services, provider for Netflix, NASA, JPL, and more. So that's not really so helpful, but as we continue to scroll down a little bit, cloud services have 3 distinctive characteristics that differentiate them from traditional web hosting. Oh, is this only about web hosting? As you go through here, you'll see that even online, right, there's not really one unified definition. Oh, this, that this is the definitive article, right? Everything you need to know, okay? And so cloud computing has become the ideal way to deliver enterprise applications. Well, how was I doing it before? What does that really mean? It actually seems to kind of indicate something else. And so just us looking on the very first page of my web search, Vaughn, you're noticing what? Man, everybody has a different definition behind all this. So when we start having something like that, we have to actually start asking well, is there a standardized definition somewhere? Well, it just depends on who you ask once again. But I also brought up this webpage, which is from Microsoft Azure here. I know this is a Cisco show, but I wanted to show you something here because it begins to try and do something that we overlook when we first begin to understand the nature of the cloud, Vaughn. Okay, so when we started this particular series, Vaughn, I don't know what you were actually expecting that I was going to end up showing, but more than likely what I thought about the very first time is, we're finally going to get to the infrastructure. I'm going to see all these different components and what it means the cloud actually is going to look like and all that. And then you go to something like Microsoft Azure, and Vaughn, all that they put right here essentially are the benefits, okay? So they tell you what the benefits are. They tell you what the types of cloud computing is, and we'll go over some of these definitions a little bit later. They even talk about cloud services that are out there, so I mean, there's plenty of them, okay? Oh, how cloud computing works. Oh, it's a little different, but they don't show any diagrams here at all, Vaughn, okay? They even tell me what I can actually do with cloud computing, okay? But there I am. I'm at the end of the page, Vaughn, and at this particular point, I hope you're actually starting to understand something. In cloud computing, it's not the idea of what's actually up there that matters. It is the way that you and I can use whatever's been put up there, okay? So what I mean by that is cloud computing itself, in terms of a definition, is really more of a description about what a particular user can do and can't do, okay, but without exposing you to the underlying technology. In other words, Vaughn, you don't have to worry. Are there servers in place or all that other stuff that's out there? If a particular cloud provider says, Vaughn, an email server is ready for you to go, you don't have to worry too much if the email server is actually up there and ready for you to go. It is. You just put in your particular specific details, and it works as an email server for you, okay? Web server, is that configured? Oh, it's configured to run. Once I actually configure the details I want and add in the stuff I want, it's actually up there. So Vaughn, in terms of cloud computing, what they're saying is don't worry about the underlying infrastructure, but you just have to decide what it is that you need to do and what you want to do, and see if the cloud provider can actually put that up there for you. So we never actually expose, in terms of cloud computing, what the underlying technology is about, okay? What we expose, though, is for the user to say, all right, Vaughn, what do you need to do? And then the cloud provider says, I can do that. Okay? That's what essentially it comes down to.
Yeah, I think of it almost like you're renting out space that already exists. It's like whatever flavor it is, or Microsoft or Amazon or Cisco, it's like they've already built the building. You're just kind of renting out one little room. So you don't have to do anything about it. It's just there. And you say, I'd like this, and they go, whoop. And it's kind of like a la carte too.
Yes.
You get to go ahead and pick the parts that you need for your company for whatever reason. And then it's just like, here you go. And then there's an interface, usually through a web browser of some sort. And then you just go ahead and click buttons. And it's like, oh, guess what? We just hired 100 new people. Boop, boop, boop. Just add a few more.
Right. So it actually is relatively easy in that sense. So besides the idea of a room, it's the equipment. It's the actual connections that are made. So unlike CapEx, right, which we talked about earlier as far as the challenge goes, in the way that cloud computing essentially overcomes some of those traditional ideas is simple, okay? In terms of capital expenditure, Vaughn, what you mentioned is exactly right. You pick the service you want to run, you immediately start with operational expense. Because Vaughn, you're not having to set up that web server. You're not having to reconfigure. You're not having to install an operating system. You're not having to make sure everything is connected the way that it needs to. You put in the details that you need to make sure that it gets online, and guess what? It's done. I don't have to buy anything. I'm renting, like what you said here, about what needs to happen.
No assembly required.
No assembly required.
It's just already done.
It's already done. It's ready for us to be able to use right away, and that's when we go directly into OpEx, okay? So that operational expenditure as well. So remember that other limitation that we were actually talking about as well, low resource utilization. Vaughn, I don't have to worry that I actually spend too much money on a server anymore, because the way that these cloud services work, they're saying, look, you don't worry about that. You're going to pay for whatever time that you use here, okay? And we'll actually say this. If you come to that point where you're running out of resources, you can bump it up if you need to, and we can add in more. Or if you don't need to use it as much, we can actually take away some of those resources, and it reduces the actual expense that you have as well. So you're actually only really using the utilization that you need to the majority of the time too. And the idea of flexibility, add in what you need. Later on, Vaughn, if you go, man, I thought this one web server would work. Now I'm getting 1,500 hits per minute. I need to add in 2 or 3 additional web servers and make sure that they're all working together. Vaughn, you don't have to go and find someone to do that. You can actually take that and then clone your own across those 3 and tell it you need load balancing to work across it, and it can work. So all that's actually available to us. So cloud computing helps us to overcome some of those particular limitations and challenges that we face with the idea of the traditional architecture.
But of course, we're going to need somebody to run these cloud computing services. Kind of like why you're probably watching this series is to go ahead and not just for this exam, but to actually be able to control the Cisco Cloud environment.
Yeah, to a point, that's right. But the elements that we'll be talking about not only help you to understand more about the Cisco environment, but whether you're working in AWS or whether you're working in Azure, whether you're working with Google Compute, whatever services are out there, the fundamentals, though, should help you to understand the technologies that are underlying that a little bit better, regardless of which particular area you go into. So that's actually a key for us. Now, Vaughn, before we actually move on, okay, is there a particular definition? Well, yes, okay. There is a definition, and it actually does come from a single place here. And I want to make sure that I show this because it's going to be important for us to understand this as well, okay? So the place that you can find the kind of official, unofficial, whatever you want to call it, right? The idea of the definition of cloud computing is from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Commerce here. And you're looking for this number right here, okay, where it says Special Publication 800-145. You also see it written as SP 800-145. That is where you find essentially the official definition of cloud computing that everybody, at least at the most basic level, agrees on. Now, you and I just read a bunch of different definitions, Vaughn, all that different stuff. Like, it doesn't sound like that there's actually a unified definition. But what they're saying is, or at least what NIST is saying, minimally, okay? In other words, at the most basic level, you have to at least agree to this before you would consider this cloud computing. So, of course, this is actually a multi-page document. It's 7 pages here. It's not a long read at all, but it's something that you don't have to actually worry about for the exam. You do need to know at least that number. You do need to know this cloud definition as we go through it, but I'm trying to get down to here, which is actually the section 2 here, okay? The NIST definition of cloud computing. Now, just a few weeks ago, as of the recording of this show, we were actually in a government shutdown, okay? And this document was not available on their site because if you went to it and said, yeah, no, due to the government shutdown, you can't download it. But you probably can download it now unless we enter into another government shutdown. So just kind of be aware that you actually see this, okay? Now, we want to actually make sure that we pay attention right here, which is actually going to give us the definition that we're really looking for, which is on this top line here, okay? Cloud computing is a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources, network, servers, storage, applications, and services that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction, okay? Now, that particular definition itself, okay, does show us that, hey, this is actually what we're talking about here. Now, notice the actual different parts that they're talking about, okay? The cloud computing itself, they're not even telling you, like, what's the infrastructure that underlines it. But notice that there's a couple of different ones here that you do want to pay attention to, okay? So first, the idea of on-demand network access, okay? Or in other words, essentially self-service here, okay? So Vaughn, you don't have to call me and say, hey, I need a server being brought up, and then you have to wait for me to respond, okay? And then I can say, oh, I can't do that until tomorrow or until next week. And then Vaughn slams the phone down and says, I can't believe Ronnie's making me wait until next week. With this one, just like you said, Vaughn, through a web management portal, guess what? You can go there and go, I need another server. Click, and the server is brought up on demand the way that we want to, okay? The other thing, of course, is the idea of what we call this, right here, okay? Rapidly provisioned here, okay? So this idea of rapid provisioning talks about the elastic nature of cloud computing. Now, that's actually a weird term, right? Whenever I think about elastic, I think about rubber bands, right? But that's the idea and concept here, Vaughn. And I don't want, I'm trying to think of a nice, but it's like when I have to wear sweatpants, it's because the band itself on the waist has to kind of, pull out when I need to.
It can grow.
Yeah, it can grow.
Shrink
And it
when
can
needed.
Yeah,
Yes.
I've never seen one of mine shrink, but overall, though, I've seen it grow. Yeah.
So for me, it's leggings.
Yeah. Okay.
You
Leggings.
just wear
Okay.
leggings.
Well,
It's a nice
there you
little
go.
elastic waistband.
Yeah. So that idea of actually being able to do that means, Vaughn, if you need more, you can have it. Okay. On demand, you can have it. Okay. If you need less, you can say, I don't need that anymore, and get rid of it. So it can grow and shrink in terms of what you need very quickly.
It's like if we're gonna go out for some pizza, you're wearing the stretchy pants.
That's right. Stretchy pants. That's a good one. Okay. Now the other one here I skipped for a moment because I have them on a different order on my notes here. Is this idea of a shared pool, okay, of configurable computing resources here. Now, what I mean by that, Vaughn, is that the service provider or the cloud provider itself, it doesn't have to dedicate hardware to you and me. Now, can it? Yes. Okay. It can say, hey, Vaughn wants this on her own particular server, and she doesn't want anybody else to share it. She can pay for it, but she's going to pay for it, okay, all on her own. But in reality, most of us don't need that. In other words, what the cloud provider can do is have what we call different tenants, okay? And that's just like the idea of an apartment building, right? There's different rooms, and not everybody actually is the same family or same group, but different people can live in the same building. And the same thing here within the cloud infrastructure as well, is that we can have different customers that have access to their own shared resources. And that's because we pulled all the resources together and saying, here's what Vaughn can use, here's what Ronnie can use, okay? So that's another one as well. Now, the other thing that you also have here, okay, is that there's also the need for what we call metered services here. Now, I don't actually have the term metered services here, but what we mean by this is that it actually charges you as you go, okay? So Vaughn, you're not having to go, all right, I have to pay how much so I can even have the privilege of using this? So Vaughn forks out $1,500, and then she realizes something. I only used it 10% of the entire time I had it, okay? So Vaughn, you wasted a lot of money, okay? Metered services means it can actually count out and say, here's how much this is going to cost you, and Vaughn can choose whether or not she wants to pay for it, or whether she doesn't, okay? So she doesn't have to pay for the whole thing up front. Again, eliminating that idea of the CapEx expenses too, okay? The ubiquitous access is the other one. Notice the term ubiquitous up here, and convenience and on-demand, which I can't highlight, okay? All of that for us is about the idea here that when we talk about ubiquitous access at times, it doesn't matter what device you're on. Now, Vaughn, this is strange because all of us have played video games on consoles, right? And you can't take the cartridge or the game from one console and put it onto another one, right? It's just hard to do, okay? Well, the idea of cloud computing says, I don't care what device you're on, Vaughn. If you can access at least the web portal, it doesn't matter if you're on a smartphone, if you're on a tablet, if you're on a PC, if you're on a laptop, whether you're on Linux, whether you're on Mac, whether you're on Windows, you can access it.
Yeah, just like our regular Nintendo NES or Super Nintendo or Sega. We've been playing a lot of old school video games here at IT Pro TV.
Yeah.
We're in a good old Miss Pac-Man tournament.
That's right. Yes, she is. Okay, I am not. But overall, though, when you start to see something like this, that means that there's a lot of these characteristics here. And the reason why we wanted to point that out is because essentially cloud computing is not about the infrastructure. It's what the idea here that Cisco says is more of an access model. In other words, it actually describes what Vaughn can access if she wants to when she starts using the cloud environment. She has access to the self-service portal. She has access to that resource pool of things that she might not have been able to afford if she tried to buy it on her own. She has that ability to actually grow her particular devices if she needs to make it actually work better, to give more capacity, or actually reduce it down to what she needs to, okay? The ability, of course, to pay as she goes. The other one is depending, or actually regardless of whatever device that you're on, to be able to manage that. And then lastly, remember that the idea of resource pooling also means that we can do what we call multi-tenancy, which is kind of the last step that I wanted to talk about here, okay? That multiple people can use those shared resources, even if they're competing. I know it's kind of weird. Even if we're competition for one another, in Amazon's, their cloud, right? I can actually be on the same server as a competitor of ours and actually sharing that same environment. But the way that it works is that you and I, okay, if we're actually competitors here, we don't even know that we're actually on the same exact server together. So we're actually essentially just separated out in that way, okay? So all this will kind of help us to get started as we begin to take a look at the idea of understanding more and more about the cloud. Now, before we do that, we're going to talk a bit more about this idea of some of this access model, because we need to actually kind of contrast that and compare that to what we traditionally understand about what ends up happening in the traditional IT department and what the cloud does. So I ran over it relatively quickly, but we need to talk about it a little bit more in detail because that's what you'll also be covering on the exam. I want to make sure you don't miss anything like that as we go through this. Let's start off, make sure if you can, download a copy of that NIST SP 800-145, understand that particular definition. And what we'll actually be seeing in the next few episodes, and we'll bring up my screen just one more moment here, okay, is we're going to be kind of going through this part, okay? Notice that they talk about the 5 essential characteristics, which I, of course, broke down into like 6, I think is what ended up happening. We're going to talk about the 3 service models and the 4 deployment models, and that will help us to wrap up at least the fundamentals that we want to get into before we start heading into some really basics of the technology that Cisco wants us to understand. So Vaughn, that for us is a great place for us to end this episode too.
All right. It sounds like also good exam material for them to possibly ask you some questions
Right.
on. Whenever you see those different numbers of there's this many characteristics and this many models, you should probably know them. So
Great note.
great. Well, thank you for that great introduction to our cloud computing. But for now, we are going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.